Hey everybody, this is Caleb, part of the Narrate team. This week, Adam talks about one idea. As your time goes, so goes your life. Well, it sounds at first glance as a very depressing topic. As we'll discover, it can also be incredibly encouraging and very helpful as well.
The right call last night? Cardinals, Red Sox, right call, wrong call? You guys are pretty ambivalent. This is how much I love you guys. I was on bed when that happened. I had quit, mostly because I was furious that the Cardinals weren't up 10-2, which is what the score should have been at that point. So if you're a guest, welcome. We're thrilled that you're here. We're finishing up a series this morning, and I was thinking this week that this is one of those rare instances for me where I'm actually bummed that we're finishing up this series. That's not to say that I'm not excited about our next conversation, and I am very excited. Actually, we're gonna do a series called "We Need You to Lead," and we're just gonna kind of address some leadership axioms, as it were. But I think the reason that I'm bummed is because I get the sense that we've just started to scratch the surface on this one. Thank you for those of you that have given us your feedback, and we've, I think, received more feedback from this series than we have in any in recent memory, which affirms to me that as long as we stay aware, I stay aware of my brokenness, we'll have stuff to talk about for quite a while. But we have to finish it up, the series this morning, because after this morning, I'll have emptied my cup. And that's not to say that there isn't a lot of other things to say as it relates to technology and how we integrate that into our lives, but just to recognize that this is kind of the bulk of my study, and I know that there's more coming later, but I'm just done. So if you haven't been with us this far, really what we did is we started by just noting that technology is a gift. It's a remarkable tool. It's fantastic in so many ways, but like any good thing, it has a dark side. And as it relates to particularly our smartphones and our use of the internet and email and things like that, the dark side is that if we're not careful, it causes us to lose presence, like to lose our presence with our present environment, to lose presence with those people that we love the most, to lose presence with our own thoughts. And part of what we've talked about is just how rare it is to think about something for longer than a few minutes because we're just so used to that stimulation. And for those of us that are spiritually minded people, just how much it can interrupt our interactions with the Lord. So we started there and just talked about presence. Like if you're going to surf the internet, great, but just do that. Like don't try to be present in multiple areas, which of course is related to multitasking, which is the second thing we talked about. And really what we explored there is this notion, because technology sells itself to us under the banner that we can do more things at the same time and thus be more efficient. And in some regard, we could argue that that's true, but what we explored is that when we do that, what we cost ourselves is excellence. And even if you're not a God-fearing person or a God-following person, like that has a handle on it. Because what it means is that when we multitask, we do whatever it is we do less effectively. And what we explored is going all the way back to the system of animal sacrifices that was existent before Jesus. What God said is, if you're going to bring me something, I want your best. Like I don't want halfway. I don't want mediocre. I don't want C+. Like I want your best. And then last week we turned a corner, and Caleb helped us turn that corner, and I think it was a very important corner because as we studied this, what we recognized is that as you dig into technology, really what you're talking about is time management. I don't know if you've noticed that, but it's just the deeper you go, it's really putting a new spin on an age-old issue, and that is, what do I prioritize and what do I not? And in fact, when I was studying this stuff personally, kind of what happens to me is I go, okay, I'm broken, I need to work on this, I'm going to learn about this, and then I did that and learned some good things, and then typically I go, well, if I struggle with it, my friends at Narrate struggle with it, so we should make it into a series. But I couldn't get past that second week. Like, okay, I got those two things, but I don't know how to make this a series, and I guess at the risk of being too honest, I don't like two-part series because putting the series together is a lot of work, and so to have one go 2 weeks and then all of a sudden have to do another one just doesn't sound all that appealing, and so I just kind of had it in the hopper, otherwise known as Evernote, in my phone. And then I heard Andy Stanley and then eventually John Ortberg and Bill Hybels talk about this as it relates to time. In fact, I said to a friend yesterday as we were headed hunting, hey, just so you know, I think I'm going to die soon because everything that I'm bumping into right now is about how my time is limited. So I don't hope that I'm going to die soon. But what hit me in this whole series is we're talking about time management. So what Caleb did last week, as I digress a bit, is to acknowledge this age-old truth, and that is you have more to do than you can accomplish. And the way God deals with that tension is something called the Sabbath. See, we think of an act of faith as giving money. We think of an act of faith as serving at a Halloween thing. We think of an act of faith as like signing on the dotted line or getting baptized. But one of the things the scriptures say about the Sabbath is you want an act of faith, take a day a week where you're not productive. Because in that act, what you're saying is, God, I trust that you are bigger than me. That the world doesn't need me, that the world will go on. If I die, someone else will be in my position tomorrow, but someone else won't be my wife's husband or my husband's wife or my kids' dad, and all those different things. And so this morning, we're just going to kind of continue on that time continuum, so to speak, and there's just really one idea I want to explore. And for most of you, it won't be a new idea. In fact, some of you will be like, okay, so when is this time over? Because I've got it. But it's just simply this: as your time goes, so goes your life. That as your time goes, so goes your life. Because you can push back on what we've said about technology. You can push back on what we've said about multitasking. But one thing that neither your technology or your mad multitasking skills can do is undo one simple truth. And that is that you only have a limited amount of time. And that as your time goes, so goes your life. As your schedule goes, so goes your life. And so there would be a lot of potential ways to talk about this. Jesus talked about this. James talks about this. Lots of people in the Old Testament talk about this. We could go to Barnes & Noble and pull lots of books off of the just business management shelf, and there are lots of brilliant ways to talk about this. But this morning what we're going to do is we're going to look at one psalm written by a guy named Moses where he unpacks this kind of systematically. In fact, if you're someone that you're like, it's not really a sermon unless it's verse by verse, word by word, then this is your one sermon a year at Narrate Church. Because that's what we're going to do, is we're going to work through Psalm 90 a verse at a time for a while. And so, good job. You made it to the one real sermon in the 52 weeks that we'll do that this year. Now, a couple things about Moses. First of all, I think if you'll do the work of getting your brain around this principle and more so adapting your life around this principle, I really think it can change your life. And I know that sounds like dramatic preacher talk, but I've experienced it firsthand in these last couple weeks. I think my wife being in Ecuador for a week and having the boys to myself for a week and all those different things have converged, that it really has been a game changer for me. And the other reason why I think this can change your life is because of the simple fact that as your life goes, as your schedule goes, so goes your life. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the dynamics there, but what you do with your time determines what you have for a life. And that's what Moses tries to impress upon us. So a few things about Moses. First of all, Moses lived to be 120 years old. Now, raise your hand if that sounds appealing to you. Yeah, see, last service too. Is everybody who's less than 30, they're kind of tempted by it, but the rest of you are like, I'm out. I've experienced 50, 120, couldn't possibly be enjoyable. I'm out. Like, I don't want anything to do with that. And I would agree with you, because you go like, that's 50 years sitting in some chair somewhere where it just doesn't sound appealing. Well, what Moses had going for him was he had his eyesight. In fact, the Bible tells us that Moses was able to see until he was 120 years old, that his eyesight worked well right up to the end of his life. Now, how many of you lost your eyesight at about 23? 30, 40, it's getting sketchy, 50, bifocals, 60, contacts are out of the equation, right? Can't blink if you wear them. There's some issues there. Moses, the Bible says he could see till he was 120, and what that means is not just trivial information. What the text is telling us there, because if you know somebody who's lost their eyesight in their elderly years, you know that life shuts down pretty quickly when you can't see, especially if you have for most of your life. And so what the Bible is telling us there is Moses contributed right up to the end. And what all that means is Moses mattered in our language. He contributed, he led for 120 years. Now, most of you, if I said, man, you get 120 good years, you'd go, wow, okay, I'll take it. But what's interesting is at the end of Moses' 20 years, 120 years, he still had some stuff to unpack. And he still looked back on his life and he went, okay, here's something that we all need to keep in mind. Now, the other thing about Moses is he had 4 lives. Like cats have 9. The elk that I saw yesterday had several because they got shot several times each, and that was his own tangent. But Moses had 4. The first one was 40 years. He was born a Hebrew. and very quickly after, he became a part of the house of Pharaoh. Now, the house of Pharaoh was among the most prestigious and powerful and wealthy families in the world, and so that meant that for 40 years, which would have been greater than the life expectancy of a lot of people then, that for 40 years, Moses had the best of the best of the best. He had the flat screen TV, he had the Xbox 720, he had whatever pizza he wanted, he had the best food, he had everything, the best education. He lived in the lap of luxury, literally. And then at 40, some things happened and came unraveled very quickly. And he moved from that to being a shepherd in the middle of the wilderness. Now, think of the excitement that would come with living in the White House, contrasted with every morning you wake up, you take your sheep out to pasture, you sit on a rock, you watch them eat, you might have a wild animal to beat away with your stick. At the end of the day, you bring them back to pasture, or back to the barn. They don't have barns, but you know what I mean. Next day, you bring them out to pasture. For 40 years. Miserable. Second life. His third life, though, was then all of a sudden God interrupted, and God said, "You're going to be my voice," and he goes back to Egypt, and he's leading these people, and he's doing all these miraculous, powerful, influential things, and it looks really, really good. And then just as quickly as that happens, they leave Egypt. They're headed out of Egypt for only God knows where, like literally. Like only God knew where they were going. Looks promising. And then all of a sudden God goes, "No, we're going to do something different. It's called NASCAR. You're just going to take left-hand turns. Like for the rest of your time here, for the next 40 years, just left-hand turns through the desert. Because I don't like these people. They don't like me. And so they're just going to die off. And when their kids are old enough, we'll stop doing NASCAR and we'll actually drive the car and we'll go into the land." And just as they were about to get there, Moses is like, "Sweet, we get to go into the land." And God says, "You don't get to go. So you know that eyesight you have? I want you to use it. Go to the top of the hill, look into the land. That's as close as you're going to get." So he has this context. Is this context for thinking about time and how we use time and how we don't use time, and it's found in Psalm 90. So here we go. Adam preaches his first real sermon, verse by verse, through the Bible. "Lord," he says, "you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations." So he's acknowledging here the simple truth: they are God's, he is theirs. This is a prayer from a man who's a part of the tribe of Israel. "Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God." So what he's saying here is God, there's the beginning and there's the end. Like there's the very beginning of this massive thing called creation. There's the very end. You were there and you're there. Like I love the word picture that one guy creates, that you're the bookends. God, you form the bookends of all of life, all of creation. And somewhere in between the bookends, there's me. Like there's this blip on the radar. Then he says, you turn people back to dust, saying, "Return to dust, you mortals." Need a British accent, really, like, "Return to dust, you mortals." It's like the ultimate Gandalf statement, right? Like, "Return to dust, you mortals," and he piles that stick into the ground. Now, what he's acknowledging here is something that I think most of us don't like, but probably most of us believe. And that is that God has something to do with how long you're going to live. And this provokes all kinds of mystery. Like, so does that mean God kills people? Does he arrange for terrible things to happen? Does he arrange for people to die? Does he know how long our lives are going to be, or does he determine that? I don't know. It raises all kinds of questions, but it cuts at the middle, Moses is saying, of something that you and I wrestle with, and that is, "Lord, you have something to do with the length of my life." And I'll bet you believe that. And here's how I would demonstrate that I'll bet you believe that. If tomorrow you were diagnosed with a terminal disease, would you pray? If tomorrow someone you loved was diagnosed with a terminal disease, would you pray? See, most of you, even if you've never prayed before, even if you haven't prayed for decades, even if you're only here because she's here or he's here, most of you in that situation, you would pray. Why? Because you're acknowledging in some mysterious, probably unworked through way, God, somehow, some way you have something to do with the length of our lives. That's what he's doing. 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. So see, Moses, he starts by contrasting how incredibly small he is size-wise compared to God and his creation. Now he's dealing with time. See, a watch of a night was 3 hours, because it'd be unreasonable to expect anyone to stay awake in the middle of the night for longer than 3 hours, though we do it to nurses and stuff all the time today. He's going, you can't do it. So that culturally it was 3 hours. A day is 24. He's saying, what's 3 hours to me Lord, is like 1,000 years to you. In other words, there's this continuum, there's these bookends, and you're at the beginning and you're at the end, and I'm this like microscopic speck in the middle of it. Like we say, oh, life flies by. Moses is going, life flies by. I was talking to a guy before the first service who spent a year overseas from his family, and he said, it's crazy how fast the time went. Now, that's not a guy going like, I don't like my wife. It was just the reality of like time flies. He continues, you sweep people away in the sleep of death. They are like the new grass of the morning. In the morning it springs up new, but by evening it is dry and withered. Now, the picture here is, when we picture a shepherd in this land taking a sheep out to pasture, most of us picture eastern Montana or even central Montana, western Montana, and as Ray Vanderland says, we picture sheep in elbow-deep alfalfa just grazing till their heart's content. Not the picture in Israel. In Israel, the terrain would be every bit as mountainous as this, except for remove all the trees and all the vegetation and just add a whole lot of rock. And so geographically what happened in Israel, can be really helpful. It unlocks a lot of different statements about shepherds in the Old Testament. What happens is you have this moist air that comes in off the Mediterranean Sea. And when it hits this dry, barren land, it doesn't happen every day. It doesn't even happen every week. But in the right circumstances, in the right places, what happens is this air hits the rock, and these little tufts of grass that look dead and completely invisible, that are like underneath and along the edges of these rocks, they spring forth. They grow. And in the span of that evening and the early morning, that dew creates this quick little growth of grass. And so a shepherd, his job was to know, where's the grass going to be today? And the sheep, their job is to get to it and to consume it before the 110-degree sun starts beating on it, because by 2, 3, 4 o'clock, it's gone, it's dead, it's withered. And Moses is saying, God, as I get to the end of my life, I just recognize that I'm kind of like that tuft of grass. Like, boom, it was there in the morning, it's gone before the day is over. Aren't you just so glad you came to church this morning? Like, isn't this like, yes, this is so encouraging. Thank you, Adam. I'm so glad I brought my friends so you could tell them they're going to die soon. Stick with me. Our days may come to 70 years or 80 if our strength endures, yet the best of them are but trouble and sorrow. See, Moses is continuing to acknowledge life is so quick, it's so short and so brutal. And you might go, so God, how do you believe in such a good God? But he continues. For they quickly pass, and we fly away. They quickly pass, and we fly away. Remember that old hymn? I'll fly away. Remember that? We've sang it on occasion around here, but not without a lot of protesting from me. Read parenthetically, Adam's a control freak and has his hands in too much. But because the theme of that song has always bothered me. Because what I've always understood that song to be saying is, get saved and hold out for heaven and to hell with earth. Literally. And I think that theology is so 180 degrees opposite of what Jesus teaches in the Gospels about the kingdom now. I've always understood that psalm to be this very escapist-driven theology. What I realized in studying for this is that's not true at all. That hymn is born out of Psalm 90. And far from saying, like, get out of here, it doesn't matter, what it's saying is life is short. Know that. Pay attention to that. If only, he says, if only we knew the power of your anger. Now, this is a tricky verse. Your wrath, we don't even like to put those words out of our mouths when talking about God. Your anger, we don't like that. Your wrath is as great as the fear that is your due. Now, wait a minute, Moses, I thought you were just talking about how small you are and how small time is and how small my time is compared to you. Here's what Moses is saying. Translators that I read, they'll admit, or that I heard, they'll admit this is a very difficult passage to translate. But here's really what Moses is getting at. What he's saying is when we get our brains around how incredibly small we are, how incredibly little our lives are, how short our lives are, in comparison to how enormous and how big and how eternal God is. What he's saying is, if we could just get our brains around the small slice of pie that we're given, if we could just get that, then we would naturally begin to ask, God, how do I use my little tiny slice of time best? It's not him saying that God is a wrathful, vengeful person that we should be mostly afraid of. It's him saying, if you could just understand and appreciate who God is and how tiny you are and how short your life is, you would be much more intentional with your time. And see, we don't get this naturally. That's what Moses is saying. Like, we need to teach you this. We need to point this stuff out. Because what Moses is saying is, if you would just get that, it will change the way you prioritize and spend your time. It'll change everything. Teach us, he says, teach us to number our days. You know what I love about teach us, that phrase? It implies that you can take a deep breath and not feel unworthy. Because what he's saying is we don't come out of the chute knowing this stuff. Might come out of the chute as a fan of a particular team, but you don't come out of the chute knowing that life is short. We got to learn this stuff. Teach us, he's saying. Teach us to number our days. And you know what? You do this. When you got married, ladies, you numbered your days. There was this day out in front of you, and you became a different person because of that day out in front of you. And everything was run through the vein of, someday I'll be out of time. Someday there won't be time to prepare anymore. At some point, the day is going to be here and the chance to prepare is over. If you've ever had a deadline at work, at school, or even more, if you've ever missed a deadline, see, you know what Moses is getting at here. What he's getting at is at some point, you arrive at this place where you realize there's no more. The chance to study is gone. The chance to prepare is gone. And ultimately what he's trying to awaken in us is that walk you took with your wife last week, that conversation you had with your son or daughter last week, that moment you had with your friends, that run or bike ride you went on. See, we interact in those moments as if we're always going to have them. Like we're always going to get to go for walks with our spouse. Like we're always going to get to sit across and have breakfast with our son. Like we're always going to get to have our health and we can go for a hike. Like we're always going to have that job. We're always going to have these relationships. And what Moses is saying is, hey, live your life knowing that at some point, those opportunities, they go away. Like the number of walks you can take with your spouse are limited. And the amount of time you have with your kids, it's limited. And so far from being a shaming thing or even a frightening thing, it's just a thing. It's just a promise thing. And here's the promise, the second part of verse 12. Teach us to number our days. Teach us that our days are numbered. And here's the promise, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. See, the promise here, the promise is that if we could live with this perspective, we will be more wise with our schedule. The promise is that if we could live with this perspective, what you prioritize and how you spend your time and how you don't spend your time and who you spend your time with and who you don't spend your time with and what gets your best energies, it'll all be determined by that truth. In other words, it kind of goes back to what Caleb was saying last week. If we could live with this perspective, we will much more naturally and emphatically put things on the table and go, I can't do that. It's a good thing, as some have said, but it's not a great thing. It's important, but it's not that important. Like everything that I want to accomplish, I'm not going to get to accomplish. Teach us, he's saying, God, give us the wisdom to know. And you say, what does this have to do with my iPhone or my internet? That's really the tension, isn't it? That it's not just a technology thing, but it's all over life. That in those moments when we stare at our phone, in those moments when we get lost on the internet, in those moments, did you know the average American watches 28 hours of television a week? Really? And then it's so easy to step on top of that and condemn it and then just go listen, if you just go home and spend 4 hours or 3 hours a night watching TV and then you watch a movie or a game a week on top of that, like that's the average, which would say it would be really arrogant for us to say, it's not me. See, the issue here is, what do you have time for? So really, if I could just summarize, what Moses is getting at in Psalm 90 is if we could just understand that our time is limited, that he's going to die, she's going to die, they're going to die, the opportunity is going to go away, the job's going to go away, someday you're not going to be able to run, your knees aren't going to work, you won't be able to ski, all those different things. If we could just live with that fact in mind, we would be a lot more wise with how we spend it. Now, what I want to do to finish up is I'm going to do you a favor. I think because a gal named Bronnie Brown does us all a favor. You may have heard of her. She's an RN from Australia who spent the bulk of her life, the bulk of her professional career working with people who had 12 weeks or less to live. And in particular, she worked with people who had just a handful of days or so left to live. And what Bronnie got in the habit of doing was asking people in the final moments of life, what do you regret? Like, what are your regrets? You can Google her articles all over the internet. I think she even has I know she has a book on Kindle that's just a couple bucks, but just read the article because I think the book is just the article. Save yourself some money. But what we're going to talk about are the top two. Now, the number two, the thing that was second on that list, I think probably won't surprise any of you. It's just simply this: I wish I hadn't worked so hard. I wish I hadn't worked so hard. And now listen to the way she says it. Go ahead, Nick, to that next one. This came from every male patient that I nursed. Underline and bold, every male patient that I nursed. They missed their children's youth and their partner's companionship. Women also spoke of this regret, but as most were from an older generation, many of the female patients had not been breadwinners. So ladies, what she's saying there is most of you can insert yourself into this because you are working women. All of the men I nursed deeply regretted spending so much of their lives on the treadmill of a work existence. See, what she's done is she's done you a favor. She's taken you to the end of your life, and she's saying, there's a regrettable ending that you can avoid if you'd like to. There's going to be this moment, and you can avoid it. And here, I think, is the challenge for most of us, is defining, like, what's the it that we're chasing instead of those people? And for most of you, it's your parents. Because they were wildly successful, and that intimidates you. Or they were miserable failures, and you don't want to be that. Or they were just average, and that's boring. You can't win if you're a parent. That's kind of the bottom line. But for most of you, it's the it. The it is your parents. And so much of who you do and what you do is in some reaction to and response to them. If it's not your parents, it's very likely some key leaders or mentors in your life. I was sitting with my wife a few weeks ago, and we were talking about this really neat leadership kind of opportunity in our community and blah, blah, blah. And I said to her, well, I know what Vern and Brian would do. Vern leads the church in Billings, and Brian and Bozeman that planted this place. There aren't two leaders that I respect more. And I wasn't even feeling shameful. I just said, I know what they would do. And she said, but you're not Vern and Brian. And it wasn't until I started unpacking this that I realized she just identified that same root. That most of us, we're chasing somebody. And if we're not careful, we end up at the end of our lives and we go, oh, I chased it and I never took the time to define it. The second, the most common regret, and this one was surprising to me. She said this, I wish I had the courage to live a life true to myself and not the life other people expected of me. I wish that I had lived the life I wanted to live. She goes on, here's her quote. This was the most common regret of all. When people realize that their life is almost over and look back clearly on it, it is easy to see how many dreams have gone unfulfilled. Most people have not honored even a half of their dreams and had to die knowing that it was due to choices they had made or not made. And listen to this last one, and this one's so hard to grasp if you're less than 40. Health brings a freedom very few realize until they no longer have it. I can't tell you how many, and I say this in an endearing, respectful way, I can't tell you how many gray heads I saw nodding last service during that last line. Health brings a freedom that very few realize until they've lost it. See, what Moses is doing is, listen, he's saying, you know what it's like to have a budget. Like, you understand how the way you spend money is differently because you don't have unlimited money. You understand that you would own a lot of things that you don't own if you did have unlimited money, but you don't, and so you live accordingly. What he's saying is your time's the same way. So spend it wisely. And so the question is, what do we do with it? How do we move forward with this? Will we do something with it? Will we move forward with it? Because here's the pushback. I'll just tell you the pushback, because I'm like you. Most of us are of that kind of same mindset where you wouldn't be here if you didn't like activity and progress and all those different things. Here's the pushback. But Adam, if I pass up on that opportunity, I'll miss it. I'll miss out. Miss what is what we have to define. Miss out on what is the question we have to ask. See, we chase these dreams and we've never defined them, which are what psychologists call shadow dreams. They're these goals and ambitions that we actually do have, but they're dark, but we've never identified them, we've never verbalized them, we've never localized them, and so we chase them, not knowing even what we're chasing. Adam, if I don't work hard, I'll lose my job and my family will be poor. Some of you are terrified of that. And yet you've never taken the time to define what poor is. Like you had some hard days as a kid and you don't ever want to do that to your kids or whatever. But the reality is you long ago passed the threshold. We talked about this a couple winters ago in a series called How to Be Rich. That what happens is you became rich a long time ago, but you didn't take the time to realize you became rich. And so you just keep chasing being rich. And in the meantime, you lose everything. Adam, if I don't, then they won't like me. Well, who are they? Like, do you know whose approval you're living for? Have you defined that? See, what happens is we can spend all this energy chasing phantoms. If there existed a program where we could input all the ways that person X spent their time, all the things they did and therefore all the things they didn't do, and if that program spit out a document that took you a few hours to ingest, to take in, to read. You go grab a cup of coffee at the hub, and after 3 hours, you've kind of owned what's in there. I was thinking this week that we could take that said document of person X, and we could send you to the hub, and let's just say that document contained how that person spent their time from the age of 20 to 40. And we could give you that document, and you could go sit in the coffee shop. At the end of that time, if you could really take in how someone spent their time, don't you think you could create an incredibly accurate sketch of them? Like, we think of the crime scene sketches and all those crime scene shows and how you sit down and go, no, his nose looked like that and blah, blah, blah. I think if we just gave you some time to take in how person X spent their time, you could sketch probably far more accurately what a person looked like. Maybe not their facial features. I'll bet you could tell us their overall health condition. I'll bet you could tell us the status of their marriage, maybe even how many of them they had. I'll bet you could tell us what their relationships with their kids was or wasn't like. I'll bet you could tell us the size of their bank account, how successful they were in the eyes of their peers, whether or not they were celebrated at work and mostly avoided at home. I'll bet you could tell us their theology. Now, it might be different than the theology they profess, but I'll bet you could tell us what they really believed about God. Why? Because as our time goes, so goes our life. So here's my homework for you, and I know this is heavy, and well, it just is. But here's the homework that I have for you, and I think this can be invigorating. I want you to grab that card in front of you, behind you. I don't know, rock, paper, scissors, somebody for one. It's a little bit of a zoo, but get that card, would you? 2 questions that I'm going to challenge you to spend some time with. If you're married, I think you got to have a date night over this. You need to have dinner. You need to go for a walk. You need to go for a drive, or whoever your friends are, however you need to process this if you're not married. But here's the 2 questions. First of all, what do you need to add? What do I need to add? Because see, the reality of this is your time is limited. It's not infinite. And if you want to do something really gutsy, especially men, here's my challenge to you. You'll have your answers, and she'll have your answers of you, and hers will be better. I think as a spouse, one of the most courageous things you could do is look across the table to each other and say, what do you say my answers are? Now, hopefully that's not in any way enabling some controlling or anything like that. It could go south, but what do you need to add? What's not being prioritized? What good things need to go because something needs to be added? And then secondly, and you're a step ahead of me, what do I need to remove? What needs to come off the list? And for most of you, that's a name. Like there's people's initials that probably have to go after that one. Like what people need less of your time? What people do you need to stop living to impress? See, what Moses does is he does us this incredible favor and says, I lived 120 years. I was so productive, more productive than any of you will ever be in terms of just the length and how many years I had and all the influence I had. And yet still, as I look back on time, what I wish I had a better perspective of was just how temporary all those moments are. Let me finish here. If you're someone, and you're one of the many that are here and you're exploring Jesus and wondering whether or not you're ready to follow him, and maybe you believe in him but you just haven't committed to him, or maybe you have some questions and you just haven't committed to dealing with those questions, listen, I'm the last person in the world that believes in creating dramatic experiences and creating this false sense of urgency that says do it now because if you get hit by a bus. I don't buy into that. But one of the great privileges that I have in leading Narrate is the number of people who in their 50s and 60s are starting a relationship with God. And it is one of the most exciting things that I get to be a part of. And they wouldn't be shamed if they heard me saying what they would say to all of you who are in your 20s and 30s and 40s and going, I think I want to follow Jesus. Those of you in your 20s and 30s who are going, I'm putting it off for another time. I'll get serious about God another time when I'm not so busy, when I don't have to make my mark on my career. Every one of them, they would echo this. And they would say, don't put that off. Don't put that off. They love what they're experiencing now. And every one of them says, man, I wish I'd have heard that when I was 15, when I was 20, when I was in my first marriage. One of the easiest things to treat as though you have forever to develop it is a relationship with God. And what those people who are starting a relationship with God, what all of them understand, all of us understand, is that one decision changes everything else. So don't shelve that part.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.